The Famicom says farewell in this patron-requested episode of NES Works Gaiden. This week's episode comes to us by request of the mysterious They Call Me Sleeper, but it actually works out as a pretty handy tie-in with the most recent episodes of Segaiden and NES Works. We've recently looked at the first entry in the Wonder Boy/Adventure Island series, and now here's the final 8-bit installation in the franchise, Takahashi Meijin no Boukenjima IV, or Adventure Island 4. Which also, by coincidence, is the final Famicom release to have been officially licensed by Nintendo.
The Adventure Island series had a strange and somewhat belated life, where Westone immediately seized upon the success of Wonder Boy and produced a string of excellent and innovative sequels in the space of about 4 years following the arcade game's debut. Hudson let Adventure Island lay fallow until the Wonder Boy series had more or less run its course. The original Adventure Island shipped for Famicom in 1986, but its first sequel, Adventure Island II, didn't arrive until 1991. About half a year before Westone's final outing for Wonder Boy himself shipped for Mega Drive. This, despite the fact that Adventure Island almost certainly raked in more cash than the Sega games it was based on. I mean, I don't have hard numbers on this, but given the relative sizes of the Nintendo and Sega 8-bit install bases, and the popularity of Adventure Island in both the US and Japan, it would have been a tremendous challenge for Wonder Boy to have outsold it. So then, why did it take so long for Hudson to create a sequel? Unfortunately, if an answer exists to this question in the realm of published or translated interviews, I've yet to find it. My first guess would be that Hudson's ambitions with the PC Engine stalled the series iteration. About a year after Adventure Island made its debut on Famicom, Hudson entered the console race with their own system, the PC Engine, aka TurboGrafx-16. The arrival of this new console meant the overwhelming majority of the company's development efforts understandably shifted away from Famicom to their own platform. Hudson didn't stop making games for Nintendo's console, oddly enough, but their Famicom output dropped by about 75% almost overnight. Maybe they would have come up with an Adventure Island follow-up sooner, but they were busy cranking out new material for a console with more impressive capabilities than the NES. Or then again, maybe not. There's no indication that Hudson actually saw Adventure Island as a potential series in its own right, because they published not one but 2 of Westone's Wonder Boy sequels on PC Engine before they revisited the Adventure Island concept. In fact, the PC Engine launched with a reskinned version of Wonder Boy and Monsterland called BIKKURIMAN World. Rather than putting their own lovable Takahashi Meijin in the lead role again, Hudson instead licensed the name and likenesses of a character-focused snack brand called BIKKURIMAN, a chocolate-filled wafer cookie beloved less for the snack and more for the collectible cards that came packed in. 2 years later, Hudson would publish a home port of the lesser of the 2 Wonder Boy 3s, the shoot-'em-up Monster LAIR. Hudson did eventually bring the original Adventure Island to their own console under the name New Adventure Island, but that wouldn't arrive until summer of 1992. And then, just to round things off, they published the Dynastic Hero in 1993, another secret entry in the Wonder Boy series, in this case Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap. This brought all 4 of the classic Wonder Boy games to PC Engine in a very confusing jumble of reskins and rebrandings. Meanwhile, over on the Nintendo side of things, it was always just Adventure Island, or Boukenjima. Of course, it's also possible that any franchise ambitions Hudson might have had were nipped in the bud early by the middling quality and sales of its immediate attempt to capitalize on the success of the first game. Takahashi Meijin no Bugtae Honey was less a sequel to Adventure Island, and more of a game based on a cartoon spin-off of the game. It strayed pretty far from the original game, giving players control of the fairy, Honey, who needed to rescue Master Takahashi and find 8 eggs hidden across the island. While the Takahashi Meijin portions of the game play more or less like Adventure Island, it also involves a lot of unrelated gameplay with mini-games that resemble Arkanoid. It was okay, but you can definitely understand why Hudson would look at this game and say, maybe this whole Adventure Island thing was a one-off. Adventure Island 2 arrived in the US in June 1991 and a few months later in Japan, and it didn't feature any snack brands, nor did Wonder Boy himself show up. Nope, it was just Master Higgins and a curious throwback of a game, a linear run-and-jump platformer that played more or less identically to the original Adventure Island. The graphics looked a little nicer, and the design was a little less based around gotcha moments, but in 1991, Adventure Island 2 felt downright retro. The one element that singles out this sequel as a 91 game is the presence of rideable dinosaur companions. Adventure Island 2 shipped about 8 months after Super Mario World debuted in Japan, complete with a cute dinosaur steed for Mario by the name of Yoshi. If Wonder Boy and Adventure Island had originally been inspired by Super Mario Bros., which seems extremely likely, Adventure Island 2 very definitely sees Hudson, who developed this sequel without the involvement of Westone, trying to capture Yoshi's lightning in their own bottle. To their credit, Hudson managed to one-up Nintendo with Adventure Island 2. Super Mario director Shigeru Miyamoto had famously wanted to give Mario a dinosaur to ride on the NES, but felt the hardware couldn't pull it off. Yet here's Master Higgins riding not one, but multiple dinosaurs. Take that, Nintendo. A second sequel followed a year later. Adventure Island 3 retained both the dinosaurs and the strictly linear forward-scrolling gameplay, feeling even more retro in its context than Adventure Island 2 had been. However, this time Hudson mixed things up a little by giving Master Higgins an inventory system, allowing players to collect different weapons and dinosaurs in the levels and equip them as they ventured into additional stages. The gear system called back to the direction Westone had taken the actual Wonder Boy games. Wonder Boy 2 played like a linear action RPG, complete with gear upgrades purchased at shops. Adventure Island 3 didn't bother with an economy, and there was no backtracking in its super retro ratchet-scrolling stages, but the flavor was there. Given this somewhat fragile creative connection, perhaps it should come as little surprise that for the final 8-bit console entry in the Adventure Island series, Hudson went full Wonder Boy 3 and turned Adventure Island 4 into a full, open-world exploratory action game complete with dialogue and inventory. Well, I say Adventure Island 4, but that's only in fan translations. The Famicom game, Boukenjima IV, has never been graced with an official release outside Japan. Boukenjima IV, which I'm going to refer to as Adventure Island here just to keep things simple, wrapped up the officially licensed Famicom release schedule. It shipped in June 1994, after which Nintendo turned out the lights and put the chairs on the table for their formidable 8-bit console, just shy of 11 years after the console's debut. For that matter, Adventure Island 4 arrived a few weeks shy of 10 years from Hudson's debut as Famicom's first official licensee, with Lode Runner and Nuts and Milk. A lot had happened in that decade, not least of which involved Hudson becoming a direct first-party competitor to Nintendo, but it's nice to see that things came full circle in a way with this final Famicom collaboration. Adventure Island 4 also symbolically wraps up the Famicom library in another meaningful way by bringing the console back to its roots of sorts. The 8-bit Adventure Island sequels had a decidedly retro feel to their design, and the free-roaming Adventure Island 4 is no different. If you apply the 5-year gap between Adventure Island and Adventure Island 2's releases to the final chapter, then this feels entirely like a product of the time it should have come out in, a work of the Famicom and NES's golden age of metroidvania adventures. The Famicom's library may have been 80% baseball titles and Dragon Quest clones by mass, but for many kids growing up in the late 80s, the games that really hit were the open-ended action RPG titles. Just look at how many modern indie games attempt to channel the spirit of NES Metroidvanias. Sadly, that style of game largely peaked around 1989 to 90, fading away to be replaced by trendier works. Multi-format action titles like Vice Project Doom, brawlers like Final Fight, platformers with an emphasis on linear action and collection. Those supplanted the Metroidvania in the 90s, an entire decade in which fewer non-linear platformers were created across all platforms than were published for NES and Famicom between 1987 and 89. Adventure Island 4 and its 16-bit follow-up a few months later, Super Adventure Island 2, dared to push against the prevailing headwinds of change and create games in which a little guy had to run around an interconnected world collecting powers that would allow him to progress to new areas. And it's not a bad example of the form, even if it lacks the brilliance of Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap. Adventure Island 4 builds on elements of its two immediate predecessors, bringing the second Adventure Island's lovable dino pals into the picture, while turning the third game's interstage inventory screen into a core mechanic. Much of Master Higgins' progress here revolves around his weapons, which he always has access to. He's come a long way from the dopey bare-handed cave kid of the original Adventure Island. Now he begins his island adventure equipped with an infinite supply of femurs to chuck at foes. Perhaps we can chalk this newfound common sense up to the influence of Tina, the tropical cutie he rescued in the original game and evidently shacked up with in the years since. The two now live together in a simple log cabin, which serves as the game's home base. When the two bunk down for the night in separate Hays Code-approved single beds, Master Higgins receives a password that records most of his current progression. As you travel across Higgins' home island to rescue the dinosaurs that some sort of evil cosmic force or something is captured, you can acquire weapons, dino buddies, and other tools a few different ways. Some of them you collect by defeating bosses, which tend to be rather less than inspired in terms of their attack patterns, while others are found by completing minigames. The minigames are interesting because they seem to be influenced to some degree by the fruit you've collected. Yes, picking up fruit remains a critical element of the action even in this more leisurely paced adventure, but it plays a different role in Adventure Island 4 than in previous titles. Where before it fed into a stamina meter whose constant depletion acted as a sort of stage timer, here it helps you in entirely different ways. When Master Higgins collects fruit, it builds onto a meter in the lower left corner of the screen, which, when filled, restores a point of Master Higgins' health bar. At the same time, the fruit meter does determine your stamina, in a sense. The more power it contains, the more robust your performance in feats of strength, such as the tree climbing minigame, which is effectively impossible to win with a low fruit reserve. Fruit works as a sort of minimalist currency in a sense, as you need to spend it in order to play a handful of minigames, which reward you with critical game items. In true Metroidvania spirit, the items you collect tend to be combat-oriented, but also double as tools. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, they tend to be tool-oriented and also double as weapons. For much of the game, there's little reason to swap out from your default tibia toss, which offers good range with its slowly decaying flight arc, if not much in the way of power. Alternate items, such as the hammer and the torch, hit a lot harder, but they generally come with severe limitations, such as range or rate of fire. The torch is great for lighting enemies and melting ice, but it forces you to get up close and personal with enemies. Since this is a game where the protagonist only has a few points of health and can only absorb a handful of hits, even once you've built up your life bar, it behooves you to keep your distance and use ranged weapons like the bone and the boomerang. Still, even if most of the alternate weapons fail to be useful on a moment-to-moment level, Adventure Island 4 succeeds where many Metroidvania-type adventures drop the ball by building that dual functionality into most of the gear. Alternate weapons with awful range typically have greater striking power than the basic bone, so you don't need to drop back into the menu screen to swap immediately away from the hammer or torch after using them to open a passage. Even items that seem to exist primarily as tools, like the snowboard, double as weapons that can take out foes in a pinch. And occasionally you'll come across minigames that require the use of special items, like the whack-a-mole event near the journey's outset that requires use of the hammer. Even beyond the fruit, Adventure Island 4 does a great job of finding ways to make items and powers originally designed for linear score-chasing action games work in this open-ended context. For example, the fairy no longer grants you temporary invincibility so you can dash through foes, but instead works like a bottled fairy in a Zelda game, reviving you on the spot in the event of defeat. Likewise, Adventure Island 4 reaches back across the series' history to create its world and the monsters that inhabit it. Familiar enemies pop up across settings that harken back to the older games, but have been reworked to function as contiguous spaces with tool-based gates to the critical path and secrets that rely less on jumping to reveal invisible items, but rather having the proper tools to simply access them. Even the final boss is a familiar sight, a sort of incarnation of the eggplant spirit that occasionally appears as a power down in other Adventure Island titles, sapping Higgins' stamina down to critical levels. All these years later, you finally get to exact revenge. While Adventure Island 4 may not be the single greatest Metroidvania game of all time, it nevertheless exists as a fine example of the form. With a sprawling world dotted with convenient warp points, a wide array of tools and weapons to collect, and crisp visuals and controls, it convincingly transforms a series of simple, linear platformers into something richer, without wandering quite so far from the original premise as the Wonder Boy sequels did. In fact, Adventure Island 4 shipped just 2 months after Weststone's final Wonder Boy game, the excellent semi-exploratory Monster World 4 for Sega Mega Drive, which didn't even include Wonder Boy protagonist Tom Tom. 1994 was basically it for the Wonder Boy and Adventure Island games, with Super Adventure Island 2 shipping in October. Along with Super Metroid, these three made 1994 a sort of last hurrah for the Metroidvania genre as a sustained force in gaming until next-generation portable and indie games resuscitated the format a decade later. Of course, there would be notable Metroidvania one-offs like Symphony of the Night and Shantae before then, but between Hudson, Weststone, and Nintendo's masterpieces here, 94 was basically it for the 2D exploratory platformer for a long time. The PlayStation was about to drop a mess of polygons in our collective lap, changing the way games worked altogether. Sadly, despite being such a fine example of the form and the last truly great 8-bit Famicom release, Adventure Island 4 has never seen an official release outside Japan. Even Monster World 4 would eventually be dusted off by Sega and published with a proper localization for Wii, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. But Hudson declined to sell Adventure Island 4 in the West back in the day, despite the fact that the NES received about half a dozen games after Nintendo had turned out the lights on Famicom. The final US release would hit in December with WARIO'S Woods. Thankfully, civic-minded fan translators have stepped up and produced unofficial localizations of the game. Not that there's a huge amount of text to convert into English to begin with. Maybe someday Hudson, or rather Konami, will see the wisdom in translating this excellent 8-bit finale and publishing it on modern platforms. Until then, the only way to play it legally is to pony up hundreds of bucks for the Famicom import, or nearly as much for the Boukenjima collection Hudson released for Game Boy Advance. Until then, Adventure Island 4 remains one of the most notable vintage Japanese classics that got away. Sorry, Takahashi Meijin, even the world's most dexterous thumb wasn't enough to defeat the vagaries of international licensing.